This video for biological psychology looks at the spec requirements that require you to compare the biological explanation of aggression with the psychodynamic explanation of aggression that comes from Sigmund Freud. Freud developed a theory of human mind that emphasized the interaction of biological drives and the social environment. He put a particular focus on the importance of childhood experiences and how these can influence how people feel and think in later life, and he referred to his theories as the psychodynamic theories. Now, Freud's theory explains that people are born with biological instincts in the same way as animals, and as people grow, they must learn to control these instincts to be accepted by others in society. He believed that any behaviour is driven by our unconscious desires. Now, Freud's assumptions of the psychodynamic approach are that human development is a dynamic process, so it's driven or motivated by certain forces. Early experience is very important, for it shapes our behaviour in later life. Freud suggested that we have different areas of the mind, the id, the ego, and the superego, that we will look at later in the video, that are in constant conflict with each other, and it is understanding these aspects of the mind that will help us to understand human behaviour. Freud also suggests that our mind is split into three sections: the preconscious, the unconscious, and the conscious. And the unconscious holds memories, feelings, thoughts, or desires that are not suitable to be brought into the conscious and for us to deal with. Dreams, therefore, are one way that we can access information that's held in the unconscious. Now, this can be through the way that they manifest themselves into our dream, and the latent aspects of these dreams is what the dream is really about. Freud also suggests that we've got a life and death instinct within us, which is called eros and thanatos, and that these are in conflict between the two, and if they are, this can lead to aggression being directed outward. Now, this catharsis is the process of venting aggression, and if we don't do this and we don't vent the aggression that's resulted from our unconscious desires, then it can build up and burst. Within instincts and motivation, Freud suggests that energy motivates our behaviour, and this is self-preservation, dominance, aggression, which is the thanatos, and the libido, which is the eros. Human behaviour, according to Freud, is influenced or driven by the desires of the unconscious. I spoke before about the mind being split into three. Now, the first of these is the id. Now, according to Freud, id is the personality construct that we are born with, and this energy is called the libido. The id operates on what we call the pleasure principle, in that it focuses on an I want basis. So I want food, I want sex, and all the basic instincts that we're born with. The ego is what we call the reality principle, and it balances the needs of the id and the superego. Now, during toddlerhood, this is when we come to realise that we are individuals and we recognise we have our own desires, wants, and this is when the ego forms in order to be able to control these desires. If you look at the picture of Homer on the screen, this is the id and this is the superego. Now, the superego is what we call the morality principle, and this is the aspect of us that is socialised by the needs or the morals of society, and we have to have the superego in order to be accepted in society as an acceptable figure. Now, this includes our understanding of what's right and what's wrong, and the superego is in constant conflict with the id. Now, because of this conflict, it's what we call a balancing act, because the strength of each force is a factor of our personality. So if a person's superego is too strong, they might be uptight, rigid, pompous. But if a person's id is too strong, then they may be delinquent, antisocial, or self-centered, because they're not taking into account the needs of society. The psyche is what Freud calls the personality: the id, the superego, and the ego. Now, in order for us to have a healthy psyche, then the ego needs to be in control at all times of the desires of the id and the desires of the superego. And the id and the superego will listen and go through the ego before making any decisions. If the superego, for example, is in control, then you may be particularly neurotic. You may think things through, you may worry too much about the consequences, and you may feel guilty or anxious when you've made decisions. We may be classed as psychotic if the id is in control, because the id will take control of our desires like sex, food, drink, sleep, and the ego and superego are powerless against it. For example, if we've got an overpowerful id that may require food and then sex, it won't care about the consequences of this, whether it hurts a partner, whether it's a willing partner, and therefore just concentrates on the immediate desires. As I mentioned before, Freud suggests that the mind is split into three parts: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Now, according to Freud, successful development through the psychosexual stages in childhood is essential to develop a healthy personality. And if we go through these stages, the id, ego, and superego will develop in a perfect balance. Freud believes that these were separate and conflicting forces requiring a perfect balance in order to have a healthy mental health. Now, the conscious is the aspect of our mind that we are aware of, so the bit that is aware of our environment, our existence, our sensations, and our thoughts. Our preconscious is the aspect of the mind that may include our memory. Now, these memories aren't in our conscious because we're not thinking about them all the time, but we can retrieve them from the preconscious, pull them into the conscious, and be aware of them whenever we need to. However, the unconscious is the aspect of the mind that we are not aware of nor able to access, and this is what Freud calls the reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that live outside of our conscious awareness. Eros and Thanatos is another aspect of our personality, Eros being the life instinct which fuels the libido and our need for self-preservation and survival, and Thanatos is our death instinct which also drives to reduce our arousal. Now, Eros and Thanatos are unconscious drives. We're unaware that they're motivating us, and the conflict between them can cause negative energy that may be directed towards other people and not towards ourselves in order to prevent self-destruction. Freud claimed that the displacement of the negative energy of Thanatos onto others is often forming the basis of aggression. Now, catharsis is really important when we're talking about Freud and aggression, and this is the process of venting anger. So if something is cathartic, it means that we have managed to release the unconscious desire or the emotion that's come from our unconscious. So, for example, crying is a cathartic release because it releases our emotion, or venting and shouting at somebody is a cathartic release because we're releasing our aggression. Now, Freud and Brewer in 1893 said that the symptoms can be caused by repressed feelings that live in our unconscious so we're not aware of, and these may come through a process of hypnosis in which we allow the feelings to be released. Nichols supported this in 1974 because they found that catharsis has a positive outcome and leads to therapeutic improvement on behavioural targets. Other research presented suggests that processing emotions in therapy can be a significant step toward positive change. Watson and Bedard found that clients with major depression who showed higher levels of emotional processing therefore led to better outcomes in therapy. However, despite this support, even Freud accepted that he was not satisfied with the results and therefore for the rest of his career chose to focus on other aspects of the psychodynamic theory. Bushman, more recently, in 2002, claimed that venting anger does not help to reduce anger and shouldn't be used within the therapy. And Gemma argued that traumatic experience, if we repeatedly relive these unconscious memories through catharsis, then they actually can be relearned and become harmful to participants. It's important to be able to evaluate the psychodynamic explanation for behaviour and aggression. Now, the positives are that Freud is responsible for recognising the importance of childhood within our lives and that unconscious sexual desires that we may have will influence our behaviour. Freud's emphasis on the unconscious allows us to explain both irrational and irrational, and this can account for many aspects of behaviour. So, for example, saying that you would behave in one way, but when actually the situation occurs, you behave in a very different way. Freud also makes us realise that the human personality has more than one aspect, and we reveal this when we say things like part of me wants to do it, but part of me is afraid to, or part of me is unsure, and this would therefore suggest that our id, superego and ego are in conflict because we don't know how to behave. Freud's theories have had a massive application to society and that they've changed the way that mental health was viewed at a time when very little was understood about mental health and therefore the treatment options were very poor. Limitations of Freud's theory, though, are that Freud's theories are often based on a number of small case studies that may be subjective because Freud analysed them themselves. Only about a dozen of these were published, so therefore we have to question whether the findings of Freud's research can ever be generalised to a wider population. It's very difficult to prove whether Freud is right or wrong. For example, how do you test the presence of the ego, the id, or the superego? Particularly, how do you prove that they're in conflict with each other? A lot of evidence that supports the psychodynamic approach comes from correlations, and as discussed on a previous video, correlations look at relationships between variables and not a cause and effect relationship. Freud's view is highly deterministic because it suggests that our behaviour is caused by factors that we can't control and therefore ignores the aspects of our behaviour that we can control. Freud has also been criticised for having an overemphasis on sex and sexual desires within our unconscious and how this will fuel behaviour. In terms of aggression, Freud does offer an alternative view to the origin of aggression, and he suggests that personality is developed through childhood, which is supported by other psychologists. However, the theory does suggest that it is the unconscious which again poses the issue of being unable to measure this. Links have been made with the biological psychology and the biological approach, with the idea of the limbic system housing the emotion through the amygdala, with regard to the psychodynamic approach, and a link between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex being in charge of decision making and the analytical part of the conscious mind. Now, if we're looking to compare the two theories, from a biological perspective, the psychodynamic approach ignores the importance of genetic factors that may influence behaviour, such as the role of hormones or changing imbalance of chemicals within the brain, such as testosterone or serotonin, which may affect behaviour. The learning theory, the psychodynamic approach, ignores the influence of reinforcement, both positive and negative, on behaviour, but both do support the idea that we develop our personality through experiences during childhood. The evolutionary approach has made links between the psychodynamic theory and the view that aggression is instinctual, and natural selection ideas of survival and procreation as a driving force of animal or human behaviour. The more aggressive species will power and eliminate over the weaker ones. Now, this is an example of a question that's come from the SAMS, and it's an 8-mark question evaluating the use of biological and psychodynamic explanations of human behaviour. Now, you must remember that because this is an 8-mark evaluate question, it does actually require 4 AO1 description marks and then 4 AO3 evaluation marks, and you must be able to do both. Don't forget as well that because it's an 8-mark question, you must include a conclusion. Now, if you look at the mark scheme for this is genuinely quite basic, and I've included this because students often find this quite an intimidating aspect of the curriculum. However, as you can see here, for the AO1 description aspects of the question, you just need to be able to outline that the psychodynamic approach suggests that we have 3 aspects to personality, outline the conscious and our conscious aspects of our memory and our mind, and also these bits down here about aggression and linking the psychodynamic theory to the explanation of aggression through the release of unconscious desires and wishes, which can be cathartic. I would also outline the biological approach, so you can choose testosterone as they have done on the mark scheme, and explain how the biological approach explains that too high levels of testosterone can cause aggression. The AO3 aspect of the question is very much based on a comparison basis, so comparing biological research methods, which are quantitative, with the psychodynamic research methods, which are qualitative in focus. Biological research focusing on neurotransmitters, which have been proven to be very important in brain functioning and linking to aggressive thoughts, whereas the psychodynamic approach focuses on the unconscious and explains aspects of behaviour through our personality. The biological approach ignores the influence of early experiences on behaviour, but attachment styles support Freud in showing this has been very important. And the biological approach suggests that behaviour is determined by physical aspects of the person, such as hormones, genes, and brain functioning, whereas the psychodynamic approach suggests that the different parts of the mind is what determines our behaviour. It's important to show here that any 8 or 12-mark question is marked through levels. Now, all good students, we should be aiming down here for a level 3 or 4. And as you can see by what I've underlined, you have to be able to demonstrate an accurate but thorough knowledge of understanding of both the biological and the psychodynamic approaches. You need to have a well-developed and logical evaluation, which is very logical and reasoned throughout in the way that you've written it. You must show an awareness of the competing arguments and have a balanced conclusion. And this bit here with the competing arguments is the bit where you must make your comparison obvious. Now, this can be done by using connectives such as whereas or in contrast to in order to be able to compare the two theories.